The studio lights were warm, but the air inside felt heavier than usual. Joe Rogan sat back in his chair, a curious smile playing on his lips. He had interviewed fighters, scientists, and world leaders, but today was different. Across from him sat Keanu Reeves, calm as always, dressed in a simple black shirt and worn jeans. There was no sign of ego, no trace of someone who had spent decades under the blinding heat of fame. The opening of the podcast had been light, stories about movies, motorcycles, and travel. Keanu's laugh had come easy, low, and genuine, but then, just 10 minutes in, Joe's eyes narrowed slightly, the way they do when he's about to ask something that's not on the notes. "Keanu, what do you think happens when we die?" It was a question Joe had thrown to many guests before, sometimes getting philosophical debates, sometimes awkward laughs. But as soon as it left his mouth this time, the atmosphere shifted. Even the producers behind the glass went quiet. Keanu leaned back, his gaze not on Joe but somewhere past him, as if looking at something far away. He didn't rush to answer. He let the silence grow, and that silence wrapped around the room until it felt like everyone was holding their breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "I know that the ones who love us will miss us." The words were simple, but they carried weight that made Joe's smile fade. There was no attempt to impress, no philosophy, no big theory. Just a truth so raw it cut through the usual noise. Joe tilted his head. "That's heavy. Why do you say it like that?" Keanu hesitated, and for a moment it seemed like he might leave it there. But then he took a deep breath. "Because I've seen it," he said quietly. "I've felt it. I've been on both sides of it. When you lose someone, the world doesn't stop. But inside you, something does. And when you're the one leaving, you can't take anything with you except what you've given." There was a stillness in the studio that wasn't just about respect. It was about connection. Joe wasn't leaning forward to interrupt. He was just listening. Keanu's hands rested on his knees, fingers curling slightly as if the memories were too sharp to hold bare-handed. "I've lost friends. I've lost family. People think, because I make movies, because they see me smiling on a red carpet, that I'm untouched by that kind of pain. But it's not like that. The truth is, it never really leaves you. You just learn to carry it differently." Joe let out a slow breath. "Man, you've got a way of saying things that hits harder than a fight in the octagon." Keanu smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Pain teaches you. It teaches you about kindness, about patience. It teaches you that every person you meet could be fighting a battle you'll never see." Joe tapped the table lightly, as if grounding himself. "So how do you keep going? How do you not let it break you?" Keanu looked down for a second, then back up, meeting Joe's eyes directly. "You don't have to be unbroken. You just have to keep standing. I'm not strong because I don't hurt. I'm strong because I choose to keep going, even when I do." Behind the glass, a producer discreetly wiped their eyes. Joe noticed but didn't comment. "You know," Joe said quietly, "this is going to stick with a lot of people. I can already feel it." Keanu nodded slowly. "Maybe that's good. Maybe it'll make someone call their mom tonight. Or hug a friend a little longer. Maybe that's enough." The conversation could have moved on, but Joe stayed with it, letting the moment breathe. It wasn't every day that someone with Keanu's quiet strength spoke so openly about the weight he carried. And for the millions who would later hear this clip, it would feel like he was talking directly to them. Joe Rogan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, eyes locked on Keanu. The first answer had been powerful, but Joe could feel there was more, something deeper. "Keanu," Joe said carefully, "was there a moment Something specific that made you see life that way? Or has it just been built up over time? Keanu's lips pressed together, his eyes lowering for a second. His fingers tapped lightly on his knee, as if weighing whether he should say what he was thinking. Finally, he exhaled. "Yeah," he said quietly. "There was a moment. A few, actually. But there's one I can't ever forget." The room felt colder, even though nothing had changed. Joe didn't interrupt. "It was years ago," Keanu continued. "I was working on a film, traveling all over. My life was loud, red carpets, interviews, schedules that barely left time to breathe. I had people around me all the time, but I was lonely. And then one night, the phone rang." He stopped there, his gaze drifting again, far beyond the studio walls. Joe could see his jaw tighten slightly. "It was a friend," Keanu went on. "She was crying. She told me someone we both loved had been in an accident. I thought maybe they were hurt, maybe in the hospital, but she just said, 'He's gone.'" Joe didn't move. The silence between them was heavy. "I remember walking outside after that call," Keanu said. "It was raining, but I didn't even feel it. I just kept walking. All the noise in my head was gone. Everything was still. I stood on a street corner in the middle of the city, and it was like the world kept moving around me, but I wasn't part of it anymore." His voice had softened even more now, and every word was deliberate. When you lose someone like that, you start thinking about all the things you didn't say, all the times you thought you'd have more time, and then you realize time isn't something you own. It's something you borrow. Joe's face was serious now, no sign of his usual grin. "How do you even process that?" Keanu gave a small shrug. "At first, you don't. You just try to get through the next minute, then the next hour. Eventually, you realize that the only way to honor them is to keep living, but to live in a way that means something." Joe nodded slowly. "And that's when you started seeing kindness as the real measure of a person?" "Yeah," Keanu said. "Because the roles we play in movies, the awards, the fame, none of that is what people remember. They remember how you made them feel. My friend, he made people feel seen. He made people feel like they mattered. I wanted to carry that forward." Joe leaned back in his chair, letting the words settle. "You know," Joe said, "a lot of people watching this are probably thinking about someone they've lost right now. And I think what you just said might help them." Keanu gave a faint, sad smile. "If it does, then it's worth saying." The two men sat in that quiet for a few seconds longer, neither rushing to change the subject. The weight of the conversation wasn't something to escape, it was something to honor. But then Joe's eyes shifted slightly, the way they do when he's about to push a little deeper. "So, if you could go back to that moment before the phone call, before you knew, what would you say? Not to them, but to yourself." Keanu looked down at the table, his hands still. "I'd tell myself to stop wasting time, to call the people I love more often, to not hold back the words that matter. Because once you lose the chance to say them, you carry that silence forever." Behind the glass, the producer's hand hovered over the soundboard, not because anything needed adjusting, but because they didn't want to break the spell in the room. Keanu's eyes lifted back to Joe's, steady but filled with a sadness that was somehow both heavy and light, like he'd made peace with the pain, even if it never left. And Joe knew, without saying it, that they were only scratching the surface. Joe Rogan sat back, rubbing his chin slowly. "You talk about carrying the silence," he said. "But most people, they try to fill it. They drown it out with noise, distractions, whatever they can find. How do you live with it without letting it eat you alive?" Keanu paused, as if tasting the question before answering. "You don't fight it," he said finally. You learn to walk alongside it. The silence isn't the enemy. It's the reminder. It tells you what matters. It tells you not to waste what you have left. Joe tilted his head, curious. Can you give me an example? Like, a time you chose to lean into that silence instead of running from it? Keanu's gaze softened. Yeah, there was this day. I was in New York, just walking. No one knew where I was, no schedule, no cameras. It was cold. I remember I had my hands in my pockets, and I was thinking about that friend we talked about. I was lost in it, you know? Then I saw this man sitting on the sidewalk. He had no shoes, just socks that were soaked through. People were walking around him like he wasn't there. I stopped a few feet away, and I just looked at him. He looked back. We didn't say anything at first. Finally, I sat down next to him. Not to give him a speech, not to fix his life, just to sit. After a minute, I asked if he was hungry. He nodded. We walked to a diner nearby. I bought him breakfast. We didn't talk much while we ate, but before I left, he said, "Thanks for not treating me like I was invisible." Keanu's voice grew even softer. That's what the silence does. It strips away all the fake stuff. It makes you see people. Joe leaned forward, elbows on the table. So you're saying you can't really be kind until you've been through that kind of quiet? Keanu gave a small shrug. I think everyone has their own version of it. Maybe it's losing someone. Maybe it's losing a dream. Maybe it's just feeling like you're not seen. When you've been there, even for a moment, you recognize it in others. And when you recognize it, you have a choice. You can look away, or you can reach out. Joe tapped his fingers on the desk. I get it. You're talking about empathy, but on a level where it's not just an idea. It's something you've lived. Exactly, Keanu said. Empathy isn't pity. It's standing next to someone in their pain without trying to take it away. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is just be there. There was a beat of silence after that. Not the heavy silence of grief, but the kind that feels like a deep breath. Joe looked down for a moment, then back up. Man, I think that's why people feel like they know you, even if they've never met you. You're not selling them anything. You're just showing up. Keanu smiled faintly. That's all any of us can do. Joe shifted in his seat, sensing that the conversation was building towards something more personal. You ever think about how different your life would be if you hadn't gone through those losses? Keanu's expression changed. Still calm, but his eyes seemed to darken slightly. Yeah, I think about it a lot. And I think I wouldn't be who I am now. I wouldn't have learned how fragile it all is. I wouldn't have learned how much a small kindness can mean. Joe leaned back, exhaling. And I'm guessing that lesson came with another story, right? Keanu nodded slowly. Yeah, one that still gets me, even now. It's about a letter I got years ago from someone I'd never met, and how it reminded me why this matters. And just like that, the room shifted again, everyone leaning forward, ready for what was coming next. Keanu sat back in his chair for a moment before speaking, as if the weight of the memory was something he had to adjust to before lifting. Joe didn't rush him. The studio was quiet enough that you could hear the faint hum of the lights overhead. It was about 10 years ago, Keanu began. I was on location, filming in a small town. Long days, late nights, hotel rooms that never quite felt like home. One morning, the front desk handed me an envelope. No return address, just my name written in shaky handwriting. I thought it might be fan mail, maybe someone asking for a photo. But when I opened it, I realized it was something else entirely. He glanced down at the table as if picturing the letter again. It was from a woman named Claire. She wrote that she'd lost her husband 2 years earlier. She said they used to watch my movies together, especially on nights when the pain from his illness kept him awake. She told me that during his last week, they watched one of my films almost every night, not because it was his favorite, but because, in her words, it made him feel less alone. Joe's brows drew together. That's heavy. Yeah, Keanu said softly. But that wasn't the part that broke me. The part that got me was when she wrote, "You'll never meet me, and you'll never know the sound of my husband's laugh. But I want you to know you were in our home when we needed someone." Joe was quiet, his eyes locked on Keanu. "I sat there in that hotel room," Keanu continued, "holding this letter, and I felt this wave of gratitude and sadness all at once. Gratitude that I could be a small comfort to someone in their hardest days. Sadness that I couldn't tell her husband myself that he mattered. And I realized we don't get to choose how or when we touch people's lives. Sometimes it's in ways we'll never even know about. But it matters. It always matters." Joe leaned forward, his voice low. "Did you write her back?" Keanu nodded. "I did. I told her thank you for trusting me with her story, for letting me be part of their life in that way. I told her I was sorry for her loss, and that I hoped she was finding ways to carry his memory forward. I never heard back, and that's okay. It wasn't about starting a conversation. It was about honoring the one she had started." There was a pause, the kind that made everyone in the room feel smaller, in a good way, like they were seeing a truth that was bigger than themselves. Joe cleared his throat. "You know, people talk about legacy like it's something you build with fame or money, but you're talking about legacy as the invisible stuff, the stuff no one claps for." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's the only legacy that lasts. Everything else fades." Behind the glass, one of the crew members blinked rapidly, trying to hide that their eyes had welled up. Joe noticed, but didn't break the moment. Keanu took a sip of water before continuing. "That letter, it reminded me that the pain we carry isn't just ours. The way we survive it, the way we treat people while carrying it, that can be someone else's lifeline." Joe nodded slowly. "So in a way, her letter was her kindness to you." "Exactly," Keanu said. "And that's the thing. Kindness moves in both directions. Even when you think you're the one giving it, it's giving something back to you." Joe leaned back, letting the words settle. "Man, I feel like you've got another one of these stories, don't you?" Keanu chuckled softly. "Yeah. One that happened years later, but in person. It was different, unexpected, and it's one of the reasons I believe in staying present, no matter how busy you are." Joe smiled faintly, sensing they were about to go somewhere even deeper. "All right, let's hear it." Keanu's expression shifted, a mix of nostalgia and something heavier. "It was a night after an event, and I was on my way out when I saw him. Just one man in the corner holding something in his hands that stopped me cold." Keanu leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly as if replaying the scene in his mind. Joe didn't say a word. "It was a charity event," Keanu began. "One of those nights where you shake a lot of hands, smile for photos, and try to remember everyone's name. I was tired, ready to leave, already halfway out the door. But then I saw him, standing alone in the far corner of the room. He was holding something small in both hands, like it was fragile. I don't know why, but I walked over. He looked up and I could see he was nervous. His voice shook when he said my name. Then he opened his hands and showed me a photograph." Joe tilted his head slightly. "What was it?" Keanu's voice softened. It was a picture of a young girl, maybe 8 years old. She had the brightest smile, the kind that makes you think she must have been full of life. He told me she was his daughter. Then, he told me she had passed away the year before. The air in the studio felt heavier now. He said she loved my movies, especially one in particular, Keanu continued. He told me they watched it together every weekend, just the two of them, because it made her laugh, even on the days when she was too sick to get out of bed. And then he said something that I'll never forget. He said, "You were the reason we still had moments that felt normal." Keanu's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. "I didn't know what to say at first," he admitted. "I just stood there, holding that picture, trying to keep my voice steady. All I could think about was how many people in that room didn't even notice him standing there. They were all caught up in the speeches and the cameras. But here was this man, carrying the most important part of his life in his hands, hoping for just a moment to share it." Joe's voice was barely above a whisper. "What did you do?" Keanu took a deep breath. "I asked him to sit with me. We found a quiet spot, away from the noise. He told me about her, how she loved to draw, how she wanted to be an astronaut, how she made up bedtime stories that always ended with the hero going home safe. I sat there for almost an hour, listening. I didn't check my phone. I didn't look at the time. I didn't care about anything else in that moment, because nothing else mattered." Joe nodded slowly, his face serious. "And I'm guessing that stayed with you." "It did," Keanu said. "Because when he stood up to leave, he handed me that photograph. He said, 'I want you to keep this, so you'll know you made a difference.' I still have it. It's in my home, in a frame, and every time I see it, I remember that our actions, our smallest actions, can become someone else's lifeline." Joe's voice cracked just slightly. "Man, you're talking about a different kind of success than most people ever think about." Keanu nodded. "Because the truth is, the world forgets almost everything. The box office numbers, the headlines, the awards, they fade. But the moments where we make someone feel less alone, those last. Maybe forever." There was a long silence. Even the crew behind the glass didn't move. Joe leaned in, almost in a whisper now. "So, what do you think that means for how we should live?" Keanu's expression turned thoughtful. "It means we should pay attention. Look for the people in the corner. Because sometimes they're holding more than just a picture. They're holding their whole world, hoping someone will see it." Joe nodded, almost solemnly. "And you think that's what all this, the fame, the work, should be for?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Yeah, to earn the chance to be there when it matters." Joe exhaled slowly, as if the weight of the conversation had settled into his chest. "I feel like you've got one more story in you tonight, something that ties all of this together." Keanu's eyes softened. "I do. But it's not about loss. It's about what you do with the time you still have." Keanu sat quietly for a few seconds before speaking, as if he was making sure the last story came out exactly right. Joe leaned in, giving him space but not letting the moment drift away. "A few years ago," Keanu began, "I was walking in Los Angeles, just a normal day. No event, no cameras, just me. I was heading to meet a friend for lunch when I passed a park. I noticed this kid, maybe 12 years old, sitting alone on a bench. He had a backpack next to him, and he was just staring down at his shoes." Keanu's voice slowed. "Something about him, I don't know, it felt familiar. That look, like the weight of the world was pressing down, but no one around him could see it." Joe nodded slightly, recognizing the kind of quiet pain they'd been talking about all night. "I stopped and said hello," Keanu continued. "He looked up, surprised. I asked if he was okay. At first he said he was fine, but then his voice cracked, and he told me his mom was sick. She was in the hospital, and he didn't know when or if she was coming home. He said he came to the park because he didn't want to cry in front of her. Joe's eyes softened. Man, that's rough for a kid. Yeah, Keanu said. So I sat down. I told him it was okay to feel what he was feeling. We talked for a bit about his school, his favorite movies, his dream of becoming a chef. I told him that when I was his age, I had days where I didn't know how to keep going either. But I promised him that even when it feels like you can't change the big things, you can still make the little moments matter. He paused, then smiled faintly. Before we left, I asked if he'd eaten lunch. He shook his head. So we went to a food truck nearby and got tacos. We ate in the park, just talking about nothing and everything. When we finished, he said, "Thanks for making today feel normal." Keanu's voice caught for just a second. That's when it hit me. It's not the grand gestures that save people. It's the moments that make them feel human again. Joe let out a slow breath. So, that's what you mean by using the time you have? Exactly, Keanu said. I don't know what happened with his mom. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. But maybe that day gave him a little more strength to face whatever came next. And maybe that's the point. We're not here to fix everyone's story. We're here to stand in it with them, even if just for a page or two. The studio fell into one of those silences that didn't need breaking. Joe looked at him for a long moment. You know, Keanu, most people come on here to talk about their career, but you've spent this whole time talking about other people. Keanu gave a small smile. Because that's where the real story is. The people we meet. The ones who leave something with us. The ones we try to leave something with. That's what matters when it's all over. Joe nodded slowly, his voice low. I think everyone listening right now is thinking about someone they should call, or visit, or just sit with. Then this conversation was worth it, Keanu said. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just two men sitting in the quiet they had earned, knowing that sometimes the deepest truths are whispered, not shouted. Behind the glass, the crew stayed still, almost reluctant to break the moment. Joe closed his notebook without looking down at it. All right. I think we just gave people something they won't forget. Keanu looked up, his voice almost a whisper. Let's hope it makes them act on it.